the Concepts from the Global South podcast. This is a podcast on the past and futures of non-European societies, which we explore through the prism of emic, etic, modern and pre-modern concepts. My name is Alisa Shablovskaya, and I am postdoctoral fellow in Iranian studies at the University of Oslo. Today we are stepping away from the Middle East to explore Mexican indigenous concepts and the colonial discourse that emerged through the encounter between European and local knowledge systems. When the Spanish arrived in the Americas, naming landscapes, objects, and the people who lived there posed one of the greatest conceptual challenges for the colonizers. They could not have done so without the mediation, real or imagined, of indigenous populations. This was also a period in which new concepts were forming in Europe, reflecting broader political and social transformations in the early modern era. How then did colonizers navigate between the conceptual changes taking place at home and the unfamiliar world they encountered in the Americas? And how can we study indigenous concepts of the early modern period today, given our own biases and the scarcity of written sources? To help us think through these questions, we've invited Cristian Miguel Torres Gutiérrez, a PhD candidate at the University of Oslo, who is currently completing his dissertation titled Archival Animals. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Elisa. Thanks for having me.
In his research, Cristian explores practices of collecting and archiving indigenous material in late colonial Mexico, focusing on animals as archives and as records for historical inquiry. Before delving into the history of archiving the creatures inhabiting the New World, let's begin with the concept of the land they lived in. The Nahuas, the largest indigenous group in Mexico, used the term ALTEPETL to describe their land. But what exactly is an ALTEPETL, Chris?
ALTEPETL is a concept that has been translated into English in several ways in different forms, from ethnic state to city-state to town or community. I will like to go back to issues of translation afterwards, but for now, it's important to say that this term was one of the most important notions that conformed the social and political life of the Nahua people in pre-Hispanic Mexico. And as you have rightly said, the Nahua, one of the largest groups in Mexico, are these people that gave, in a way, that bequeathed unto us this concept. The concept is articulated in the Nahuatl language, the language spoken by the Nahuas. And Nahuatl has this characteristic that many languages have of being an agglutinant language. That is, putting together one word with another, it creates a whole new meaning. And in this case, in the case of ALTEPETL, the words that are put together are atl, meaning water, and tepetl, meaning mountain. This results literally in ALTEPETL being a water mountain. But it is more than that. It is an articulation, an abstract articulation of representing the territory and the people, and it shows the unity between land and its inhabitants. There are some constitutive elements that have been identified of within an ALTEPETL. Federico Fernández Crisliev, a cultural geographer from Mexico, is the one that has pointed out in three different directions. The first one would be understanding ALTEPETL as community. In this sense, it is important to notice that ALTEPETL, or its plural form in Nahua, ALTEPEME, were these organizations that consisted of different calpuli. Calpuli is a word that is translated as guards, and these are smaller units that divided also society into social groups. These social groups would be the Pipiltin, or we would understand them as noble class, and the Macehualtin, the commoners. These people had as a ruler what is now termed as the Tlatoani, and that would be translated as the one who speaks, the one with the word. That comes from the word Tlatoli, which is literally word. So this has been usually translated as king, and there are many issues of understanding someone who has the word as the king, even though there was definitely some notion of a dynastic ruler that would establish continuity. But we can come back to that later. So far we have the Calpuli, which were these smaller units. We have the Tlatoani, which be the speaker. And the interesting thing is that when the Spaniards arrived in what is now Mexico, they would maintain this kind of organization, adapting it, putting themselves on top of both the Pipintli and the Macehualis in the social hierarchy, but keeping it as a way of exerting control over the community. This is as far as understanding ALTEPETL as community. We can also understand ALTEPETL in relation to law, because ALTEPETL were bounded by customary law. There were very clear responsibilities of what each member would have to do and fulfill these responsibilities regarding the paying of tribute and providing labor force to organize also festivities. What is interesting here is that this were organized in a rotational way, which means that before going into that, I have to say that even though there is a long history of ALTEPEME having animosity against each other, but also cooperation, it was very common to join forces and create what would be called as an alliance that would be understood as a way ALTEPETL, meaning the great ALTEPETL. And in this sense, there was no clear center regarding how an ALTEPETL was organized, because depending on where the king or the Tlatoani would be placed, they would rotate the center between the different ALTEPEME. So the Spaniards saw this when they came. They saw a center that had been established, but they didn't identify really the rotational system. So they decided to term the one that they found at the time they arrived as the main, what is the word? They would call it cabecera, but it would be like the main center of that particular town, which means that this entailed the freezing of an organizational structure into a more fixed setting, which was actually more fluid. So this is as far as ALTEPETL understood as law goes, but there is also ALTEPETL understood as land. And in this case, there was a mythical and historical element that would connect the environment and the people there. There is the notion of hills, there is the notion of water, which has to do with the geographical features of the land. And of course, this comes as no surprise, because in every settlement, if you have a mountain and you have water, you would kind of expect to have all of the resources that you would need to kind of flourish. So access to food sources was expected. And that is how ALTEPETL understood as land would be. But the thing is that ALTEPETL is not one or the other. It's the three of them combined. So it is a complex system, and it is a complex concept in terms of how we understand the organization of indigenous people and the Nahua people in Mexico. As far as the human transformed landscape, we can also see in ALTEPETL that there were three public buildings that were important to kind of understand how it was distributed. That is a palace, a temple, and a market. So these are the elements that you would find within the ALTEPETL that would never fail to be there. The connection to the landscape in ALTEPETL is also reflected in the myths that are told between each ALTEPETL. They would have a very clear origin founding myth that would connect them to the place where they were standing. An example of this is found in the one of the most famous codex in my field, which would be called the Tira de la Peregrinación. I don't know how to translate that into English, but it has the word pilgrimage in it. And there is an issue with that, because it wasn't really not a pilgrimage, what is depicting, but rather a migration. Because migration is kind of how founding myths were presented here. There was a mythical land from where this ethnic group would come, and then you would see all their movement from that place to where they arrived. And in this case, the Tira de la Peregrinación that I mentioned is narrating the founding myth of the so-called Aztecs, a group that never called themselves as Aztecs. That is a misnomer that we have, a kind of a colonial heritage, and mainly popularized by Alexander von Humboldt in the 18th century. This codex is narrating this pilgrimage, and then what you would have is the patron god of the so-called Aztecs, which actually call themselves Mexica, told them that they needed to leave that land and needed to arrive to a place where they would find an eagle that would be standing on a nopal, or a cactus, and in their mouth and in the beak, the eagle would be holding what is called an atlachinoli, another interesting concept that we could explore later. But atlachinoli means the union of atl against, you have water, and then you have fire. So it is a very powerful concept that was also understood as a symbol of war. Then with the arrival of the Spaniards, the atlachinoli got interpreted as under a religious significance, putting a snake instead of the fire and water together, and which is what we have now in the national flag. If you see the Mexican national flag, you have in the center the seagull with the snake in the beak. So you have the founding myth there that tells the story of the Aztecs, and that is showing the connection that they have to the land through this history of migration. Another important thing about ALTEPETL is that there was a way of inhabiting it that was practiced and performed and repeated every year. And that connects to a notion of walking the landscape. So to kind of process all the extent that was encompassed within the ALTEPETL, the inhabitants would perform a ritual of walking all of the different borders that were encompassed within this territory, which were not completely isolated from others. They were more fluid, and I will come back to this. But it was a way of recognizing the space through moving within it. You see that repeating that ritual every year of moving with the sun to try to follow the cycles to recognize the place that they were living in.
This is fascinating. So what you are describing here is a complete different epistemology. And you mentioned the concept of a landscape, but we can see an array of beliefs later judged as religious, mythology, social hierarchies, political organization, all of it in this concept of ALTEPETL. But what about the Spanish terms, which were used to describe this, what we would call today landscape? Did the Spaniards have the word for landscape, or what word were they using?
The word that we now use in Spanish for landscape, which would be paisaje, is a word that was not in current use at the time the Spaniards arrived there. They did have other words to refer to similar concepts approaching a definition of that. And those had been identified with different types of connotations. For example, you have the word that is used now to refer to the rural parts of a certain settlement, which would be pueblo. But at the time, pueblo was a way of referring not only to the physical aspects of that settlement, but also to the people in themselves. So there was a connection between the space and the people who were inhabiting it. It was also used as a synonym of community, and that was one of the ways of approaching landscape. The other word that the Spaniards used was that of pago, and this is a very interesting one because it was used synonymously as land, but pago etymologically is connected to the notion of paying. So pago is something that we still use in Spanish to say when you have to pay someone, you perform a pago. That came about because of the connection between having to pay a certain tribute and being in one specific space. And an interesting fact is that in Romance languages now, this word pago gave rise to our notion of country. So país comes from that, but also paisaje has the same root. So landscape, country, and to pay are all interconnected. And the last one that the Spaniards would use was that of pintura, which translates more or less as painting, but at the time was used more to refer to cartographical depictions of space. And a pintura was both a representation of the space, but also a way of having legal authority to claim that same land, so that it served a twofold purpose. So there was in itself no word that would only refer to what we understand now as paisaje, but there was this three different ways of approaching it, which in a way came together when you see the concept of ALTEPETL. All of the three of them play a part in it.
You mentioned the picture, the painting, and it seems to be a very important practice in the early modern European world to convey meaning, what land should mean, how it should be imagined politically, the representation, the instrumentalization of art in projecting one's legitimacy. But what is the idea of power or the idea of community, which is inherent to the early modern notion of landscape? Because we don't have the same type of community organization in Europe and in the New World in that period. So, how does the conceptual framework of landscape or paisaje, or the three terms you have just mentioned, differ from that of ALTEPETL? What is the main difference in the way the land was imagined?
I think something that really helps me think and ponder with that question has to do with how we understand and interpret landscape. And in this case, Tim Ingold's notion of landscape, which he opposes to, or not opposes to, but rather presents as working in pair with the taskscape, would kind of help us show how ALTEPETL would integrate what Ingold is proposing here. And in this case, Ingold is saying that taskscape would refer to how people do things together, how they act, not relating to a specific date, a specific calendar, a specific time set on the clock, but rather what needs to be done regarding the necessities of the people or also the necessities of the place where they inhabit. So there is a sociability of the tasks. And in the case of the ALTEPETL, seeing the organization of the festivities that I mentioned early, seeing the rotational system and how deeply connected it is to also to agricultural cycles, you would see that ALTEPETL integrates this notion of taskscape with landscape precisely because of the socialization of tasks. So the concept of landscape would differ from the concept of ALTEPETL insofar as ALTEPETL allows for accounting for this integration of taskscape and the socializing of all the tasks that the inhabitants are doing. It accounts for how they dwell in the landscape, but also it accounts for other rhythms that are not necessarily those of the society, but those of the nature as found in agricultural practices.
Fernandez Christlib, in his article on ALTEPETL, argues that Landschaft and ALTEPETL could be considered as synonyms precisely because of the modern functions of ALTEPETL, describing organized communities as subject to a customary law and possessing a specific piece of land. This link between community, law, and land existed in the early modern German conceptual repertoire, but was absent from the Spanish conceptual universe. Hence my question to you, Chris. Can we argue that the Nahua, who had this sophisticated concept of ALTEPETL, were more modern than the Spaniards?
I think this is a very interesting question, and it also can be answered depending on how we conceived modernity. Of course, the first thing that comes to mind is thinking with Latour and saying that we have never been modern in itself. Because Latour, with this modern constitution, he contends that modernity fails to acknowledge an interconnectedness between people, the natural world, and this results in several environmental and social issues and so on. And in this case, it seems to be that the Nahuas are eluding such an approach with the concept of ALTEPETL. There is no differentiation insofar as the concept in itself ties together people and nature, and it's not clearly differentiated, but rather all a part of the whole. So following Latour, his claim would be that this world characterized by this contradiction between two modes of existence, the pre-modern and the modern, would show how the pre-modern, in the pre-modern mode, humans and non-humans coexist, and there is this web of relationships, whereas in the modern, humans are cut off from nature and placed in a realm of pure culture. So if we agree with Latour, then they wouldn't be modern in that sense because they don't have this fissure between culture and nature dividing them. So yeah, I would say that the concept of ALTEPETL would show that this division is absent, and it's eluding the consideration of Nahuatl speakers in being modern in this Latourian sense. However, we also have to consider the other side of the coin, thinking how modernity may emerge through contact with the peoples from the Americas, through the realization that there is much more of what we know, and also to these encounters which in itself were acts of contamination and creation where something new emerged, where there was no erosion of a pure, pristine indigenous, but rather something novel emerging from the contact of these two different cultures. That is one way of saying that both yes and no, they are modern and non-modern, but that is my take on it.
So let's now talk about translation. You mentioned the term ethnic state, but is it accurate to translate ALTEPETL as an ethnic state, or does that translation miss something essential?
I think it is correct insofar as each ALTEPETL would think of themselves as sharing a same founding origin myth from the place where they came. But it's also a bit risky depending on how we understand issues of ethnicity. If we follow the primordialist branch of it, where there is such a thing as pre-existing ethnicity, then we would fall into certain risks, given the fact that ALTEPETL in themselves, at the time, historically, they would consider themselves ethnically different from others. But nowadays, we all think together of the Nahuas as one ethnicity. So we would run the risk of kind of creating a monolithic image of what they are. But at the same time, the constructivist approach to ethnicity would show that indeed ethnic state is what we had with this articulation. So it is a good way of approaching what an ALTEPETL was, but it also misses the part of the relationship that it has with the landscape in itself, I would say. There is too much emphasis on the individual sociability and not so much on the relationality that they had with the different aspects of the natural world.
So translation was one of the practices which the Spaniards were using while dealing with this indigenous knowledge. What were other practices? How did indigenous knowledge enter the Spanish worldview and shape Spain's own trajectory towards modernity?
Well, I would say, even though we have already mentioned it, but translation here is crucial, and we have to understand translation in several ways. And this is when thinking about translation in an expansive way helps us. We have the interlingual way of thinking of translation, where meaning occurs in between languages. But we have also something very interesting that is the cultural translation, and that is how meaning is carried from different spheres. In this case, there are epistemological translations happening, trying to make meaning of whole systems of knowledge with your own system of knowledge, and in the process creating something new. So we have to approach translation here to see how it created our idea of what the indigenous people were, because in the end, it was necessary for the Spaniards and the colonizers to show what they had encountered because of this shock of approaching something so distant from what was known. And in the process, several techniques were crafted to kind of mobilize this information. Visuality was one of the most important ones, relying on pictures, relying on drawings, relying on the pinturas precisely, so that you could make the empire travel, so that you could show the extent of the territory to the crown. So the interesting thing here is that in trying to produce this type of materials, for example, in the early stages of the colonization, in the second half of the 16th century, there was a full enterprise that attempted to map the whole extent of the new acquired territories. And this became known as the Relaciones Geográficas, or geographical reports. That was a set of questionnaires where they charge informants with the task of telling them the extent, the resources that they had. And these were questions answered in the very traditional manner of just writing down with words the resources that they had, sometimes in Nahuatl, accompanying the native name of, let's say, a plant or a remedy, but also in Spanish. But the interesting thing is that the final question was that of producing a pintura, as I mentioned, a map of the region. And in producing this, what you got was a very eclectic way of conveying the knowledge that they had about the space, because the cartographical practices of indigenous people were so different and so varied between each other that this material at the time was deemed useless. It was not so easy to make sense of it. What it shows here is that capturing visually what these territories comprised was crucial in also incorporating the knowledge that they had. And it's also interesting that indigenous people would use their own tradition of preserving memory, in this case, through the images that they would produce. And you can see that when you examine the maps, where sometimes it is difficult to interpret exactly, to pinpoint. If you are used to just seeing maps as a faithful rendition of the territory, if this is not a very controversial claim, it's difficult to pinpoint exactly where in space you would locate the things that are being represented. For example, distances are not necessarily trying to match scale, but rather measured in time. And this is something that maybe you can still see in a linguistic phenomenon that we have in Mexican Spanish of counting distance with time and not necessarily saying the kilometers or meters, but I digress. Yeah, the image would be conveying all of these different practices, and the important thing here was to know how to read them, and most of the times it was not possible to read all of those, all of the meaning that was embedded into it, because by the time the maps are being produced, this is the generation where all of the people that had seen what it was to have, if you will, a pristine Nahua culture were dying, and the society was mainly mixed, and then what you're getting is something new, something that is emerging that doesn't approach necessarily a purified version of the Nahuas.
Well, it is interesting that you mentioned that empire could travel with these images, but it is in the very act of travel and through images that a polity becomes empire. And empire is nothing without its subjects. So what about the indigenous and their place in the empire? How has the figure of the indigenous person been politically instrumentalized in colonial and post-colonial context to project power?
Well, in the colonial context, one of the things that occurred was that indigeneity was a way of showing the continuity and legitimacy that someone would have in terms of the ties that they had to the region. A very important thing to remember is that the Spaniards kept favoring the indigenous elites. They were treated in a different way as the commoners. And this was very strategic, because if you see the territory, this is a vast extent of land that needed to be kind of controlled. And we cannot overemphasize how colonial rule was not this extremely thought through and properly oiled machine. It didn't work like that. It was messy, and they didn't have this control. And I would go further and say that our constant referring of a colonial period as this all-encompassing machinery that would do this is also a way of perpetuating a colonial image that shows something that is not as powerful as we think it is. It did affect some change that is massive, a transformation based on racialization and the dispossession of the indigenous people, but at the same time, it was operated on a more messy scale. And this is just to say that when it came to exerting control over the territory, it was important to keep nourishing the alliances that the Spaniards had made when they arrived, because this was a very small army that arrived during the conquest that relied on getting together with all of the other indigenous groups, some Nahuas as well, that were trying to oppose the more powerful so-called Aztec Empire. And in this sense, there was some favors that were kept for these other communities. So it was important to instrumentalize, going back to that question, the notion of an indigenous lineage so that you could actually exert some claims to the land and ruling over it. And during the colonial period, you can see this in several cases where elite indigenous people would actually dig deep into what they call their own archive and the archive creation, and look into remnants of that past that would show that there was a certain continuity between their ancestors and themselves so that they could be favored by the crown. And that was really important. But that came hand in hand with the fact of assembling archives. And this is something that, for us working in history, is really interesting to see how the notion that they have of archive is a notion that only comes into being insofar as it is necessary to assemble it oneself and to dig into the different sources that were scattered there so that we can show that continuity was legitimized. Of course, this is a history of indigenous elites, if you will. It's difficult to see the other voices if you just follow that. But this same archives would actually then become the foundation of what came to be known as the Mexican Republic. And independent Mexico would use many of these collections to also construct their own national identity, and nation building then was built on certain notion of being indigenous that was closely tied to that ancient lineage that was traced by other indigenous elites. So in a way, in a more post-colonial context, the idea of the indigenous is instrumentalized to give way to the nation that is the nation-building project, while at the same time freezing a bit in time what it means to be indigenous and what it meant to be indigenous, and as if it was something distant from the past that no longer is appreciated in the present.
Let's now talk about your own research on archival animals. How did you come across this concept of ALTEPETL, and what did it bring to your own research?
Yeah, well, when I came across ALTEPETL, I was trying to see. Anyone that has researched a bit on Latin America would agree with me that colonial Mexico, and particularly the Nahuas, are one of the more overstudied communities and periods of this kind of branch of historiography. But I still felt that confronting records, confronting modern practices, confronting the archive, what the scholar Diana Taylor calls or termed as the archive, with the repertoire, that is, ephemeral practices with the more sedimented ones, kind of presented contradictions between how this history is told. And also, I didn't find it very useful to keep thinking in terms of the national bounds of what is now Mexico or what was colonial Mexico, when at the time there was not such thing as thinking of this territory as a whole, particularly in terms of collecting and classifying, which is what I'm interested in. I came across the concept of ALTEPETL way before my sources showed it to me, but it kind of reactivated when I saw that the collectors that I was studying were actually following ALTEPETL as the notion of where to connect, where to collect, and where to find documents. And with this, write their own stories or histories of a particular people. So this helped me to see that the notion that was being created of the indigenous people in Mexico was not one of a monolith where everything got reduced as a unified people, but rather these were people that would show heterogeneous when looked closely. And also, it was a way of establishing a very interesting notion of writing history. So when the collectors, which are mainly antiquarians and naturalists that I follow, were tracing these documents and these materials in the ALTEPETL, they had a very interesting idea of what it was to write a history, because they were following a tradition that the Spaniards had in presenting the history of that territory as a relación or relation. And the notion of ALTEPETL resounds loudly with that, because relación shows how people are in relation to their natural surroundings. And the act of writing a history was not saying this is what happened in the past, but rather this is the way people interacted with their surrounding. This is the relación that emerged. So the concept of ALTEPETL helped me to move from this national approach and try to look into the more nuanced differences between indigenous people.
So this act of collecting, as you describe it, ultimately perverted the indigenous knowledge. And what we can find today in museums or archives is not the exact indigenous knowledge if we are looking for authentic concepts and representations. So where can we find this indigenous knowledge today? What are other places to explore?
That is a good and complex question for me to answer, particularly because I feel that many of our own epistemological constructions have emerged from the encounters with other cultures. So in a way, it's also assuming that such a thing as the pristine indigenous will be very difficult to find using tools that are not part of that particular episteme in a way, because they are full systems of knowledge in themselves that don't necessarily commensurate with our own. But at the same time, it is possible to recover, or not recover, but rather appreciate how our own shared conceptualization of ways of knowing is reliant on the different traces that have been left by encounters with other people. And we could say, yes, we find it in museums, we find it in communities, and nature in itself, yes, but also we find it in the way we think about this idea of what it is to be indigenous, because the same notion of indigenous in itself is something that comes from the outside. It's something that we would understand only insofar as it accounts for what we have created of the image of the indigenous. And maybe perhaps we will come to a point where we can dispense of that term to account for the plurality of worlds that implies to be indigenous. But what is so fascinating to me is to see that there is no pure access to pristine indigenous culture, but rather contaminated access that we can always appreciate in our own systems of knowing.
So about our systems of knowing, we are both historians, and of course we use such terms as urban and rural, borders, culture, nature in our research, in our writing. And as you have just mentioned, they are all kind of contaminated, or they contaminate the concepts we are trying to represent with our own biases. So apart from history, the discipline of history, what are other disciplines and approaches we should engage with to study indigenous knowledge in order to avoid distorting it or instrumentalizing it?
Well, an important thing to consider here, and I am in a very early stage of my own disciplinary development, but one thing that I have always found fascinating is when there is co-production and co-laboring with actual indigenous communities, so that we kind of have to be more pushing towards this form of scholarly production, so that we can actually see how concepts emerge in their own terms without us having to impose something on it. At the same time, it will be interesting to see that in this process of co-creation and co-production, there might be misunderstandings, mistranslations, and that is also crucial to the understanding of what makes the differences emerge, and also an embracing of difference, not as something negative where we are distorting and in a way not doing favor, but as a way of showing that these differences also mark certain similarities in how we understand what the borders that we are artificially drawing, if that makes sense. So, yeah, I think it's just encouraging more. I have to here remind of a very interesting and powerful phrase that was said to me, and this was precisely during a conference on indigenous knowledge where there were Maya participants, which from the Yucatan region of Mexico. And many of us academics, as you know, we were using this common phrase of giving voice to the indigenous, and our whole goal was to give voice and, break the silence that they have been into. And then one indigenous participant stood up from the chair and said, "I've been hearing this for a long time, and I just have to say that we have a voice, and it's really loud, and we know how to use it. So the voice is there, and insofar as if the subaltern can speak, I would say it's speaking, and we just need to know, learn the languages that they speak, learn the codes." And here's when I would I would just raise a caveat to translation, which is we could be open to approaching indigenous knowledge and their systems without translation, but rather into what Rauni Kokaken, a Sami scholar, has termed epistemic literacy. That is, learning also to unlearn our own epistemic biases, to learn new epistemologies, and to see how they can be welcomed in the academy without needed to be translated, but rather to give them their full place as whole systems that can stand on their own. So that's the only thing I can say about this without actually preaching something.
Well, thank you so much, Chris, for this amazing conversation. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. I have to say goodbye for now, but I hope we'll continue later someday. And thank you for keeping with us. And please find the relevant links to literature in the description of the episode. Stay tuned.